No matter who the original oldest race was, it's going to be uncovered by this site this year, most likely, the DNA. It's in writing in Delaware, and they shot anything that came to the coast. Their number one priority was to sail up and push back everybody off the coast so they could land and start, and they did. They built Fort Christina. It started in 1629. Just like our boy Christopher Columbus. You see, you're going to come in and take whatever resources it is and eliminate the people who own it. And we're going to teach you about all that. Place. We have the scientific evidence, the unequivocally approves and proves. It approves the idea and it scientifically proves it. It's absolutely science. It's law. It's real.
Our story begins during the Age of Exploration, the 1600s, in the city of New Amsterdam, which would become the city of New York. New Amsterdam was located in the Dutch colony of New Netherland, the future colony and state of New York. New Netherland was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, and it had grown from two small settlements established primarily to manage the fur trade to becoming an international trading hub and a melting pot of many different cultures, religions, trades, nationalities, and philosophies. This is where New York City's reputation as a financial and cultural capital of the world was born, with the Dutch colonists of New Netherland. However, in many ways, the colony was a victim of its own success. The Dutch West India Company wanted to run the colony the way they ran their other outposts around the world. Principally, the company's priority was to establish military trading posts and ensure continuous profit. The Dutch West India Company did not see themselves in the business of establishing permanent colonies. However, unlike other outposts, there was a growing, culturally thriving population in New Netherland. As a result, the colony lacked a representative government or a governmental structure of any kind. This differentiation worsened upon the arrival of William Kieft in 1638, the new Director General of the colony. It is uncertain how or why he was appointed to this position by the company, but we can speculate he had good family connections back in Amsterdam, and it was a case of patronage or even nepotism which brought him to govern the colony. When Kieft arrived, the colony was in disorder. He was determined to exert the iron authority he believed was necessary to turn the colony around. The office of Director General was absolute. There was no political structure, no judicial body, and no representative legislature. The Director General was given a single tool to rule the outpost on behalf of the company: military dictatorship. Now that would all be fine if this was nothing but a simple trading post in an isolated part of the world. But the development of the colony on Manhattan Island was different, both in a financial sense and a cultural one. The idea of the New World inspired people to come here and build something new for themselves and their loved ones. The culture of the Dutch Republic allowed a more liberal society to flourish compared to their conservative English Puritan counterparts in New England. Dozens of currencies, from doubloons to guilders, but especially wampum, was traded within the colony. The Hudson River offered access to the vast and rich frontier, as well as fertile land for colonists. It could have been, and came very close to being, a long-term province of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch West India Company spent a considerable amount of money maintaining the growing colony in New Netherland and providing soldiers to protect the trading interests of the settlements. As a result of this burden, in 1640, the company surrendered its monopoly on trade in the colony, in the hopes non-company trade would bring more commerce into the colony that could be subject to a 10% import tax and a 15% export tax. This decision allowed free trade to blossom, an instantaneous boost for the people of New Netherland, but not for the Dutch West India Company. Their interests were not for the growth of the colony, but for the growth of the company. And the company watched the profit that could have gone to them now go into the pockets of competitors. This new laissez-faire, free trade commerce for the colony only served to burden the company more, since the growing economy was solely theirs to maintain and protect, but not entirely theirs to receive profit from. In addition, The Dutch made several agreements with nearby tribes to defend them against their enemies in the north, in exchange for assistance in collecting furs and other goods for the company. But now that the company lost their monopoly on trade in the colony, their treaties with the local indigenous nations was simply another burden, and there was now pressure from those within the company to resolve this problem. So William Kieft decided to act. Using the Council of Advisors, which he controlled, he decided to demand the Native American allies pay taxes for the service the Dutch were providing. Kieft opened the council meeting with this directive. Whereas the company is put to great expense, both in building fortifications and in supporting soldiers and sailors, we have therefore resolved to demand from the Indians who dwell around here, and whom heretofore we have protected against their enemies, some contributions in the form of skins, maize, and seawan, and if there be any nation which is not in a friendly way disposed to make such contribution, it shall be urged to do so in the most suitable manner. The tribes surrounding the city of New Amsterdam were of the Eastern Algonquin dialect, specifically within the Munsee subgroup. The tribes of the Hudson Valley were collectively known as River Indians due to their proximity to the Hudson River, at that time named the North River. The river tribes included the Raritan of modern New Jersey and Staten Island, the Hackensack of modern New Jersey, the Tappans of present-day New York, and the loosely assorted tribes of modern-day Westchester County that made up the Wappinger Confederacy. Historians have debated how these tribes were structured, but for the most part, the majority of the natives living within proximity to the Dutch colony were of the Wappinger Confederacy. The term Confederacy has been used for many larger, well-organized, and connected bodies of native tribes, such as the Iroquois Confederation in northern New York. However, it is generally believed that the Wappinger were decentralized and made up of loosely associated bands. Some of the bands, such as the Siwanoy, were identified by their geographic location. In fact, the name Siwanoy loosely translates to salt people, since many of their settlements were located along the salt waters of Long Island Sound. Contrary to popular belief, the indigenous people of the Hudson Valley did not solely rely on fishing and hunting wild game. They did hunt and fish plenty, but their main sustenance came from the cultivation of fertile soil found near the fresh waters of the area. Their chief crops were corn, beans, and pumpkins. When Henry Hudson sailed up the river in 1609 that would later bear his name, he recorded his admiration of the splendid fields of maize, better known as corn, growing upon the banks. The notion that these were primitive people is simply incorrect. While from the European perspective they were disadvantaged, initially lacking animals to assist them in their labor or tools except those made from stone or animal bones, their achievements in the face of these challenges further prove how skilled and knowledgeable they were, as they used the environment around them to their complete advantage. This was especially true in the selection of where to construct their villages. It was important to choose geographically strategic locations that would benefit the inhabitants of the settlements. The Wappinger village at the heart of our story is one example of a strategically located community. It was called Nanachistuwak, and its location in northern Westchester County offered its inhabitants access to good land to cultivate crops, natural springs and streams as a source of drinking water, and a plethora of wild game to hunt. Local folklore claims the natives took advantage of the steep ridges in the area, using hunting parties to surround and drive herds of animals into the valleys formed by these ridgelines, trapping them in a natural enclosure. Like most eastern Algonquin villages, natural resources such as grass, brush, bark, and hides were used to build their homes. Behind me is an example of one of these two structures that could be found in a village of this region. This single-door wooden hut would likely be constructed as a seasonal structure, propped up in the spring and early summer months. A hole would traditionally be left in the center to vent out smoke from the fire inside. We know them as wigwams. The second structure type found in these villages were longhouses, also referred to as castles. These were more permanent structures since they could endure the conditions of winter, as well as offer more communal space for the inhabitants of the village. Descriptions of these structures from European missionaries portray the interiors as being very dark, smoky, but well insulated, especially when dozens of families were all together inside. The Wabinger village of Manichistowac had 3 longhouses, described as being set up parallel to one another in street fashion, with each longhouse measuring approximately 80 paces long. The village was constructed at the foot of a mountain, which protected the village from the northwest wind. These details indicate that this was a permanent village. The attention to detail in selecting its location to be sheltered from the wind, the construction of more permanent structures in street fashion, suggests that this was a place of permanence and likely significant. This village was more inland than settlements along the Hudson and the coast of Long Island Sound. It could perhaps have been a retreat of sorts, but the unfortunate truth is, no one knows for sure. But what we do know is its name, Nanichistowac, which means place of safety. The dark irony of this name would unfortunately soon be realized. When William Kieft announced his intention to tax the Native Americans for the protection provided by the Dutch West India Company, longtime residents of the colony, who knew the regional tribes fairly well, warned him against this move. They told him the native people were not as simplistic as he imagined, but he insisted. Kieft met with several chiefs and made his demands clear. Some of them simply dismissed him, others laughed at his demands, and this angered Kieft, so he decided to take advantage of an incident which had just occurred on Staten Island, the theft of some hogs from a colonist's farm, as an opportunity to flex his power. He accused the Raritan tribe who lived on Staten Island of the crime. Kieft sent a group of soldiers to a Raritan village on the island to kill several of the natives. In response, the Raritan retaliated by attacking the very farm which had been the subject of theft, killing 4 farmhands and burning the farmhouse down. In reality, the thieves who stole the hogs were Dutchmen. The farm belonged to a man by the name of David de Vries, who was friendly with the indigenous people and warned Kieft that the natives would retaliate. But that didn't stop Kieft, who decided to offer wampum to members of allied tribes for the heads of Raritan warriors. This was, in his mind, a clever way of avoiding direct conflict, and it worked. Despite most tribes refusing the offer, Raritan were now being attacked, and records indicate at least one native who strolled into Fort Amsterdam with a human hand dangling from a spear as a trophy was paid by the Dutch for his services. The Raritan quickly ceased hostilities, and it could have ended there, but at the same time as tensions were dying down with the Raritan, in August of 1641, a member of the Turtlegangnyc, a Wapinger-associated band, murdered an old man on the outskirts of the colony. It was completely unrelated to the Pig War on Staten Island, but rather an act of vengeance for the long-ago murder of the native's uncle. Kieft, once again, retaliated. In order to start a full-scale retaliation on local tribes, Kieft needed the support of the colony. This motivated the formation of the Council of 12, where the citizens of the colony could nominate representatives to serve on their behalf. The council elected David de Vries, the same man whose farm had been attacked on Staten Island, as their president. This was the first recorded representative body to exist in the history of New York. For that, Kieft does deserve some credit. Unfortunately, it would soon be clear that Kieft expected this council to rubber stamp his decisions rather than actually represent the population of the colony.
This became evident when the council met to decide how to respond to the murder of the Dutch colonist by the unnamed Wappinger. Kieft wanted the tribe to surrender the murderer or be exterminated completely. The council disagreed, feeling war with the local tribes was not the solution. The colony had mostly been at peace with the natives for 2 decades, so to start a war would be disruptive. The local indigenous people helped provide the furs and pelts that were the economic lifeblood of the colony. The council agreed that by all means the murderer should be punished, but they were aware that Kieft would ignore their decision.
After continuous disagreement with the council, William Kieft dismissed the Council of 12 and continued to move forward with his plans. It would be on the night of February 25th, 1643, that everything would change for the city of New Amsterdam.
The journal entries of David de Vries tell us that on that night, he and Kieft were having dinner. De Vries was attempting to talk Kieft out of an attack on the local villages, but Kieft stated he had a mind to wipe the mouths of the savages. Later, when they had finished their meal, Kieft instructed de Vries to go into the main hall of the fort, where he found soldiers massed for attack. Before his eyes, 2 parties were formed, one to march 2 miles northwest to raid a small group of natives at Corlaer's Hook, now on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and attack a larger group camped in an area called Pavonia, now Jersey City.
De Vries was horrified. These tribes had come to the Dutch seeking sanctuary from Mohawks farther north. They had always been peaceful and helpful to the Dutch. Now William Kieft wanted them exterminated. From the fort of New Amsterdam, where the present U.S. Custom House stands today near Battery Park, De Vries recalled that around midnight,
I heard a great shrieking, and I ran to the ramparts of the fort and looked over to Pavonia, saw nothing but firing, and heard the shrieks of the natives murdered in their sleep. De Vries heard the returning soldiers boasting that they had massacred or murdered 80 Native Americans and considered it a deed of Roman valor in murdering so many in their sleep. Disgusted by the attacks at Pavonia and Corlaer's Hook, De Vries would leave the colony later that year. He would never return.
the Council of Eight decided to hire an Englishman from the nearby colony of New Haven. This man's name was John Underhill, and he had earned a reputation as an experienced soldier and Indian fighter. He was a veteran of the Pequot War, where he murdered hundreds of men, women, and children in the infamous Mystic Massacre of 1637 in present-day Connecticut. He would justify the atrocities by stating, "Sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. We had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings."
The council requested Underhill, along with an auxiliary force of 150 men from New Haven, to assist the Dutch in the destruction of major villages inland. They were offered 25,000 guilders as a mortgage. If estimates are correct, that would equate to an astounding $1.5 million today. The English colonists of Connecticut did not object to the agreement to attack the villages. Their settlements in Greenwich, Stamford, Bridgeport, and New Haven were within close proximity to the unrest in New Netherland. In addition, many were upset by the deaths of Anne Hutchinson and other English colonists in the region.
John Underhill may have had a personal motivation to fight the river tribes for murdering Anne Hutchinson, who he defended back in the Massachusetts Bay Colony years earlier. He was also exiled from the colony alongside her in the 1630s. Whatever the reason, whether it be profit, vendetta, protecting the colonists, or personal hatred of the native population, John Underhill accepted Kieft's offer. He organized 2 companies of volunteers, roughly about 120 men, with Mohegan scouts, and joined the conflict already underway.
The first efforts of the combined Dutch and English forces were, for the most part, ineffective. An expedition was sent to clear Staten Island, only to find abandoned villages. They did manage to secure corn in this raid, which pleased the hungry colonists of New Amsterdam. The second expedition had similar results. The plan was to move inland, following information provided by a sympathetic Native American guide who had reported an important village that would not be expecting an attack. Forces landed on the Connecticut coast and moved inland, but failed to find the village. Their guide was nowhere to be found. The European force assumed that he had either given warning to the Wappinger or simply abandoned them. They retreated back to the coast, where they were able to pillage several small Siwanoy and Wappinger settlements near Stamford and Greenwich. A more successful attack was conducted on Long Island at the request of colonists who had been under threat of an attack from the indigenous Metawack tribes of the western half of the island. Participating in this attack was La Montagne, the other member of the first council formed by Kieft in 1640. Commanding the Dutch forces, La Montagne and John Underhill killed 120 native people. The combined Dutch and English forces returned from Long Island, while John Underhill traveled to Stamford to uncover any information on the supposed important village not found in previous expeditions.
In March of 1644, Underhill found the native guide who had indeed gone astray the night of the second expedition. As it turned out, he was now in danger of being captured or killed by the Wappinger, who he claimed were about 500 strong. We don't know the details of why he was in danger, though one can assume that it may be related to his first attempt in helping the Dutch and English forces. Why he had abandoned them the first time, only to come back later, may never be known. To make up for the abandonment during the first attempt, he offered to guide John Underhill and the combined Dutch and English force to the large village inland. A force of 130 men were assembled, Underhill to lead the English and Hendrik van Dyck to lead the Dutch. They embarked in 3 yachts, small wooden vessels, and landed in Greenwich, Connecticut. Most likely, they landed here, at Tomac Cove. While the official report on the attack does not name the exact location the combined force landed, it can safely be assumed to be Tomac Cove, which was the main town dock, and it was the closest cove with deep enough waters to allow vessels to enter and dock. Its present-day location, in the neighborhood of Old Greenwich, does not present itself as anything other than a picturesque coastal neighborhood in one of America's wealthiest communities. But 378 years ago, the combined force led by John Underhill landed here. They stayed for the night, and in the morning, began their march northwest.
A description from a Dutch colonist in 1647, 3 years after the massacre, is the only account we have for this event. He describes how they marched over stony hills, over which some had to crawl on all fours. The harsh winter made the snow deep and difficult to traverse for the force. After nightfall, around 8 o'clock, they came within a mile of the village. The colonist reported the force had crossed 2 rivers, one of which was 200 feet wide and 3 feet deep. They decided to wait until 10 o'clock to attack the village.
The moon was full that night, casting a strong light against the mountain, which protected the village from the northwest wind. The description of the village, its 3 long houses set up in street fashion, are from the Dutch accounts. The guide's information was accurate this time, and paid off for Underhill and his forces. The village was larger than any they had attacked in Manhattan, Livonia, Long Island, or Staten Island. Several sources claim that on this night, the Native Americans were having a corn festival and had invited members of neighboring tribes and settlements to join them in the festivities. Local historians believe that the 2 bands of the Wappinger who lived in this village, the Siwanoy and the Kankateki, were using this festival as an opportunity to integrate their bands with 5 others of the Wappinger Confederacy. This reportedly included the Raritan and possibly the Ramapo. This is not confirmed and is still in debate, but whoever was there, it is doubtful that they knew what was about to transpire.
The order was given. The Dutch and English forces charged into the village, opening fire on its inhabitants. The natives were awake in a moment and began fighting back against the surprise attack. They deployed themselves into small bands, either returning fire with bows and arrows or charging toward the European soldiers with hatchets. It was of little use. The musket fire created a large ring of smoke, blinding the natives. In a short span of time, 180 natives were dead outside their houses. The remaining inhabitants of the village barricaded themselves within the longhouses. They discharged arrows at the attackers through holes in the walls of the structures. The account describes that Hendrik van Dyke and John Underhill resolved that there was nothing more to be done. They gave the order to set the 3 longhouses on fire. Those within the structures tried every means to escape. It is described that once it was understood that there could be no escape, the natives returned to the flames, choosing to perish by the fire rather than die by the hands of the European invaders. The most disturbing description from this report is how out of the hundreds of men, women, and children, not a single one was heard to cry or scream. According to the sole account of the events, the natives themselves estimated 500 to 700 men, women, and children of the former village had been slaughtered. 8 managed to escape, 3 of them being severely wounded. No recorded testimony is known to exist from any of the 8 survivors, though supposedly we know of a medicine man and his grandson who arrived the next day only to be met with the sight of their burned family members. Out of the 130 Dutch and English soldiers, 15 were wounded, and only 1 was killed. When the massacre concluded, the soldiers built fires to camp for the night and tend to their wounded. In the morning, the force set out to return to Stamford and to arrive by the evening. The account describes how they marched with great courage over that wearisome mountain, crediting God for affording extraordinary strength to the wounded. When they arrived in Stamford, the English treated the soldiers very well, making them feel as comfortable as possible. They then returned to New Amsterdam, and upon their arrival, after having completed their mission in massacring the Wappinger Siwanoy village, a thanksgiving was proclaimed. The massacre at Nanachistawag was the most devastating event of Kieft's war. The 2 bands of the Wappinger who inhabited the village, the Siwanoy and the Tankateki, were estimated by author S.F. Cook to only have a population of 1,800 in 1620. The slaughter of 500 to 700 Siwanoy or Tankateki would mean the loss of a third of the total population for these 2 closely associated bands.
The barbarity of this event and the rest of the war on both the native population and the Dutch colony would eventually lead to a truce that was finalized on August 30th, 1645. Several chiefs representing the different tribes, bands, and loose confederations who fought the Dutch met with William Kieft in front of Fort Amsterdam.
Oratani of the Hackensack, Sesikemu of the Tappans, Willem of the Rekawawank, Mayowatenaman of the Nyack, and Apye of the Wikwisgeek were there either to represent their own tribes or to serve in the capacity of attorneys of the neighboring chiefs. Both sides agreed to a firm and inviolable peace, and agreed that future disputes would be settled diplomatically. The war was now over.
By this point in time, only a small number of colonial villages remained occupied. Many settlers had returned to Europe during the conflict. While the New Netherland treasury was almost non-existent, Kieft had accumulated over 4,000 guilders during his term in office. If estimates are correct, that would equate to $240,000 today. In addition, William Kieft, who had come to New Amsterdam confident in his ability to turn things around, had reportedly become an alcoholic by the end of the conflict. The Council of Eight spent the years after the Pavonio attack of 1642 working desperately to convince the Dutch West India Company back in Holland to replace Kieft, as they viewed him and his war as a threat to the colony, those who lived within it, and the indigenous people who for so long had been kind and helpful to the Dutch colonists. The company eventually agreed to remove him, but for different reasons. They saw no problem with his dictatorial style of leading the colony, but were disturbed by his willingness to declare war, followed by his unwillingness to ever take the field. At no point did Kieft ever put himself on the front lines of combat, choosing rather to send company soldiers to commit his atrocities. The desire of the council to see a representative government or personal freedoms for the colonists was ignored by the company, who felt the colony's true problem was the lack of a director general who understood the correct manner to use force. Kieft was officially removed in 1647, and as he departed New Amsterdam, a crowd gathered to shout and swear at him as he boarded his ship. The mood was festive. There was even celebratory cannon fire. The company replaced Kieft with a man by the name of Peter Stuyvesant, arguably the most well-known director of New Netherland. He would serve until the colony was surrendered to the British in 1664. William Kieft was to return to Amsterdam to answer for his actions during his tenure as Director General. However, the ship carrying him, the Princess Amelia, would sink off the coast of Swansea, Wales. According to two survivors, Kieft acknowledged his responsibility in the events which occurred over the previous decade before drowning in the waters of the Bristol Channel. William Kieft never answered for the atrocities he inflicted on the natives on behalf of the Dutch.
So see, the East Coast Native Americans, their tribes were already destroyed. The Trail of Tears, that was the final cleanup, folks. Remember, it started with the 13 colonies. And the Native Americans that were there, the proof is still all up and down the Susquehanna. The DNA is there. The artifacts are there that proves that a key civilization site that is central to world history